If you've been with us over the last couple of Sundays, then you know that we've just had some amazing days around here. All of the things that we hoped would happen as a result of the new Sunday schedule seem to be happening. Our contemporary service has been packed out on Sunday mornings. This service is full. It has been both Sundays. I've heard from people who have attended the morning prayer and communion service, and they've been pleased. Children who have not been in worship are showing up with their families in the worship services, and adults who have not typically been attending Sunday school classes are now making their ways into the Sunday school classes, and it's just been really amazing. Now, I can't begin to tell you how relieved I am personally, because I'd kind of believed to the core of my being that this was the right direction for us to head. But you never really know how something is going to be received. And so for several weeks leading up to last Sunday, I was pretty anxious. In fact, about 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, one night I just woke up in the middle of the night and I had this cold sweat. And I had this nightmare. It was a dream. And the dream was that when I stood up to preach last Sunday morning, everybody'd be so unhappy about the time of the change that they would all boo and hiss as I stood up to preach, you know. But you didn't do that. Thank you. And then a couple of days later, before the service we got to last Sunday, I was sharing some of this with Jenna. I told her about the dream, and I was kind of looking for some pastoral care and some pastoral sensitivity, and instead, Jenna said, you know what you really need to be worried about is if they boo and hiss when you sit down. Well, you didn't do that either. So thank you. You also know, if you were here last Sunday, that we launched into a new series of sermons entitled This Is Us. And we're spending the month of August talking about who we are as a church. We're looking at our identity, and we're discussing some of our values, and even more important, we're trying to look at who we believe God is calling us to be as a church. And earlier this week, I was reflecting on all of this, and I started wondering, what do people who are not members of this church, people who don't attend here at Dunwoody United Methodist Church, what do people who maybe live in this community or who have just heard about Dunwoody United Methodist Church, what do they think of when they think of our church? And several things occurred to me. For example, it occurred to me that maybe when they think of our church, they immediately think of missions. After all, this church is heavily involved in missions. As we alluded to earlier in the service, 1,200 of you showed up yesterday to help package more than 300,000 meals. And a little bit earlier in the service, we commissioned our second international mission team. And our youth have been on a couple of mission trips. And over the last several weeks, we've been engaged in Mission Mondays. And we've just had all sorts of missions. We do have all sorts of missions going on in the life of the church. And so it occurred to me that maybe when they think of this church, they immediately think of missions. Or I began to think, well, maybe when they think of this church, they immediately think of one of the programs in this church. In a couple of weeks, our preschool program will be at full throttle. Did you know that this year marks the 55th birthday of our preschool program? Started back in 1962. And, lives of children, some of you have had children go through it. Some of you who went through it may have had children now who have gone through it. And I just started thinking about all of this, and I started thinking about how far the witness of Christ has extended because of our preschool program. And then I thought about some of the other programs that we have in the life of the church that not only touch people in this church, but people who are beyond this church. And it occurred to me that maybe when other people think of this church, they think of one of the programs in the church. Well, maybe they think of something else. Whatever it is, one of the things that I hope everybody has An image that comes to every single person's mind when they think of this church is that this is a church where everybody matters. Where it doesn't matter what your income level is or what your politics are, or what your sexual identity is, or what your race happens to be. Everybody's welcome. Everybody has a place. Everybody matters. Now, there are some things that, as a church, we don't tolerate. And Jenna kind of alluded to that a little bit earlier. We're all aware of what took place in Charlottesville, Virginia. And as a church, we don't tolerate racism or injustice or violence in any way. But we do believe that every single person matters. One of the reasons why I hope this is one of the images that immediately comes to many people's minds when they think of this church is because this, of course, was one of the things that characterized Jesus' ministry. Regardless of where he went, regardless of what he did, regardless of who he encountered, everybody mattered to Jesus. For example, you remember one day he was coming down the side of a mountain, and he had just finished preaching the greatest sermon that had ever been preached, the Sermon on the Mount, and there was a great crowd of people that had gathered around him. And then all of a sudden, there was this leper that appeared right in the middle of all of them. And in that day and in that culture, there was no more dreaded disease than that of leprosy. In fact, in that day and culture, if someone had leprosy, they were required by law to shout wherever they went, "Unclean, unclean." And this was to try and protect the other people so that they could get away if a leper happened to be in their presence. And suddenly this leper is standing there in front of Jesus asking for his help. How did Jesus respond? Well, Jesus would have been well within his rights and certainly within the law if he had just shunned the man and immediately turned and tried to get away from him as quickly as he could. No one would have thought any less of Jesus for doing so, but no. What did he do? Instead, we're told he reached out and he touched the leper and said, "Be clean." The leper may have had a terrible, deadly, contagious disease, but to Jesus, he still mattered. Or again, you remember on another occasion, Jesus was teaching in the temple, and again, a crowd had gathered around him, and suddenly some of the religious authorities had brought to him a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. Now, just imagine that for a moment. This wasn't a woman who had a reputation for being an adulteress. Maybe she did, but that's not the context of the story. Instead, she was caught in the physical act of adultery. Imagine the shame, imagine the humiliation, imagine the fear that she must have felt. And then comes the question, according to the law of Moses, it says that this woman should be stoned. But what do you say? How did Jesus respond? Well, once again, he would have been well within the law and well within his right simply to say, "Do with her whatever you wish." But instead, let that one who is without sin be the first to cast the stone. And then after everybody leaves, Jesus looks her in the eye and he says, "Go, and don't ever sin again." In that culture, this woman was a throwaway. But to Jesus, she mattered so deeply. To Jesus, there were no throwaways. To Jesus, you did not have to prove your worth. You didn't have to live up to a certain set of expectations. You didn't have to prove that you were worthy of his love and of his acceptance. Have you ever felt that way before? Have you ever felt like you had to prove your worth to be accepted? You probably have, because we live in a culture that constantly bombards us with that message. At work, what are you told? You're told that if you want to survive and thrive in this organization, you better prove your worth. Our children, many of them play sports. What are they told on the fields and in the gyms? They're told, listen, if you want to play in the game, you need to prove your worth. Sometimes we're even told this in our homes, aren't we? Not long ago, I turned on the television at our house, and I had planned to watch the news, but it happened to be turned to a channel, and I happened to catch just about the last 5 minutes of an old I Love Lucy rerun. Anybody in here remember I Love Lucy? Well, some of you do. Some of you, you're too young to remember it, but it was this old I Love Lucy rerun. And if you know anything about the I Love Lucy series, then you know that the whole series was built around this idea that Lucy and her sidekick Ethel were constantly getting into trouble of one kind or another. However, in this particular episode, it was not Lucy and Ethel that got into trouble, it was their husbands, Ricky and Fred, that got into trouble. They decided to play a practical joke on their wives, and it backfired, and suddenly the police showed up, and they were arresting Ricky and Fred, and Ricky, he got going, and he started talking about as fast as I am, and he tried to explain the story, and he explained that they were the husbands of Lucy and Ethel, and that this was all a practical joke, and everything was okay. And when he finished the story, the police just kind of glanced over at Lucy and Ethel for confirmation. They just kind of looked up and said, "We've never seen these men before in our lives." Have you ever felt like even in your home, you had to prove your worth? I hope not. I hope not, but even if you have, I want to tell you something this morning, and I hope you'll hear it. You do not have to do anything to prove you are worthy of Christ's love and acceptance. He loves you and he accepts you just as you are. Now, if you choose to be a disciple of his, he's going to want you to engage in the school of discipleship so that your life can be transformed from what it is into what he wants you to be. But he loves you and he accepts you simply because you are a child of God. In fact, this is what Christ expects of his church. The church is intended to be Christ's physical body in our broken world. Therefore, because everybody matters to Christ, everybody should matter to the church. This is the context of that lesson that Rick read for us just a few minutes ago. Once again, Jesus was teaching. Once again, a crowd had gathered around him, and some of them were tax collectors, some of the most despised people in the country. Some of them were sinners, throwaways, and some of them were the religious elite. Now, the way that Luke tells the story is he implies that the tax collectors and the sinners are lapping up every word that Jesus has to say. And when the religious elite see this, they start grumbling. Do you know what it means that they were grumbling? It means that they thought they were better than everybody else, and they were unhappy with Jesus' message of inclusion. And so Jesus, in response, breaks into a series of 3 rapid-fire stories. The first story he tells is about a shepherd who loses a sheep, and he goes out and he searches for that sheep until he finds it. And when he finds it, suddenly he just breaks into joy. And in the next story he tells about a woman who has 10 coins and she loses one, and she searches and searches until she finds it, and then she breaks into great joy. And the third one that Rick kind of introduced, but he didn't really read, is the story of the loving father who has 2 sons. One is a wild son, one is a dutiful son, but both of them are lost. However, the father refuses to give up on them until they're both found. Now, why does Jesus tell this story? These stories. Partly he tells them because he wants those who feel lost, the tax collectors and the sinners, and maybe even someone in here this morning. He wants them to know that they matter deeply to the heart of God. But he also tells these stories so that the religious community might understand that, in the words of Victor Hugo, to love another person is to see the face of God. Now, let me tell you how this came home once to me personally. Back a few years ago when my wife was teaching, and she was teaching 5th grade, she had a student in her class by the name of Guadalupe. Guadalupe was a young Hispanic girl who was extremely overweight. She was socially awkward. She came from the other side of the tracks, and for a whole variety of reasons, she was just not very well liked by the other students in the school. And frankly, for that matter, she wasn't even all that well liked by the different teachers in the school. But somehow she and Carol just kind of bonded with one another. And one day, about halfway through the school year, Guadalupe came to Carol, and she said, "Mrs. Brown, I've got a problem." And then she went on to explain that she was about to have her 13th birthday party. And she said, "But no one will come." Can you imagine? And then there was a long pause, and she looked up longingly at Carol, and she said, "Do you think you and Mr. Brown could come?" Well, the question kind of caught Carol by surprise, and she said, "Well, I don't know. I'll have to check with Mr. Brown. But we'll see." Well, that night, when Carol came home, and when I got home and we were eating dinner, she explained to me that no matter what I had on my calendar on Saturday night, cancel it, because we were going to the birthday party for a young girl that I'd never met. You can imagine my excitement about that. But then she explained the story to me a little bit. And so we went out and we bought Guadalupe a couple of gifts. We didn't buy anything big because we knew her parents didn't have a lot of resources and we didn't want to embarrass them in any way. And then on Saturday night, we went to her home. And our plan was just to go inside to leave the gifts, or spend a few minutes and let her open the gifts, and then to leave. But from the moment we first stepped inside of the house, it became apparent that we were the guests of honor. Now, no one in that house spoke English except for Guadalupe, but we just knew. And we knew for a number of reasons. For example, her mother had fixed what for them was a very elaborate meal. And no one else would eat the meal until first we ate our meal. To tell you the truth, that kind of scared me just a little bit. I let Mikey try it. And later, when dessert was served, we were served first, and after we finished, everybody else ate. And then it came time for her to open her gifts. And finally, it came time for us to leave. And when Carol and I stood up to walk to the door, all of a sudden, Guadalupe, who was seated on the other side of the table, got up. She raced around the table, and she threw her arms around Carol's waist. And she looked up and she said, "Oh, Miss Brown, this is the best birthday I've ever had." That night, when we drove the short distance home and throughout the rest of the evening, Carol and I were very quiet. Why? Because we knew that night we had been visited by Christ and a young, Hispanic, overweight girl who was socially awkward and who didn't have many friends. Dear friends, everybody matters to Christ. And for that reason, everybody matters to the church. Let us pray. Holy and loving God, may the power of your Spirit work within our hearts. For those of us who feel lost this morning, help us to realize we're not lost. Your love is reaching out to us, meeting us right where we are within this moment. And Lord, help this church, who has been so good at helping other people feel that they matter, to become even more effective and efficient at saying, everybody matters. In the name of Christ we pray, amen. Our closing hymn.